Hey everyone, I am Lucas Bennett, a small town teacher who thought I had found my happy place in Spokane, Washington until the HOA sent a fake cop to find my car garage. I was not even a member, but they tried to bully me into tearing it down. Spoiler alert, I took them to court and exposed their whole scam. Stick around for a story of garage battles, sneaky HOAs, and a victory that will make you cheer. I am just a regular guy who loves teaching kids and working on cars, and this whole mess started because I wanted a space to fix up my old Mustang. It turned into a fight I never saw coming, but one I am glad I won. I am a 40-year-old elementary school teacher living in Spokane, Washington, in a cozy neighborhood called Evergreen Meadows. I have been teaching third graders for over a decade, and I love it, but it can be exhausting. There is nothing like the feeling of seeing a kid light up when they finally get a math problem or write their first story. But after a long day of lesson plans and grading, I need a way to unwind. That is where my passion for cars comes in. Ever since I was a teenager, I have loved tinkering with engines, especially vintage ones. But a few years ago, I bought a 1969 Ford Mustang, a real beauty that needed a lot of work. It is my pride and joy, and I have spent countless weekends bringing it back to life. When I moved to Evergreen Meadows, I knew I needed a proper space to work on it. So I built a small car garage in my backyard. It is nothing fancy, just a simple structure with a metal roof, a workbench, and enough room to store my tools and the Mustang. I am no mechanic, but there is something magical about bringing an old car back to life. It is like teaching, but with more grease and less grading. Evergreen Meadows is the kind of neighborhood you see in movies with tree-lined streets and friendly faces. It is a suburban area on the edge of Spokane, where everyone knows each other and kids play in the yards until the streetlights come on. When I moved here 2 years ago, I felt like I had finally found a place to call home. And the neighbors were great, always waving as they walked their dogs or stopping to chat about the weather. I would often work on my Mustang with the garage door open, and people would stop by to check on my progress. Some of the neighborhood kids loved watching me tinker, and I would let them sit in the driver's seat pretending to race. It was a nice way to connect with the community, and I felt like I was fitting in. I even started hosting small get-togethers in my driveway, sharing a few beers with the adults while the kids played nearby. My garage became a little hub for the neighborhood, a place where people could gather and talk about cars or just life in general. I thought I had it all figured out, a balance between my teaching life and my hobby. That is until the HOA decided to stick their nose where it did not belong and turn my peaceful life upside down. I had been living in Evergreen Meadows for about a year when the trouble started. I had no idea what an HOA even was back then. I mean, I had heard of them, sure, but I never thought they would be a problem for me. When I bought my house, the real estate agent never mentioned anything about an HOA, and I did not see any paperwork about it. I figured I was in the clear, just a guy with a house, a car, and a garage to work in. I spent my weekends fixing up the Mustang, dreaming of the day I could take it for a proper drive through the Spokane Hills. The garage was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the stress of teaching and just focus on something I loved. I poured my heart into that space, making sure it was sturdy and functional. Was not much to look at, but it was mine, and I was proud of it. Little did I know that my quiet little hobby was about to land me in the middle of a neighborhood drama I never signed up for. It all started on a sunny Saturday afternoon when I was in the garage working on the Mustang's engine, completely unaware that my life was about to take a wild turn. That Saturday afternoon, I was in my garage working on the Mustang's carburetor with the radio playing some old rock tunes in the background. I had the garage door open, letting in the warm Spokane breeze, and I was in a good mood. The car was coming along nicely, and I was thinking about taking it for a test drive soon. I just wiped my hands on a rag when I heard a loud knock on the gate at the side of my yard. It was not a friendly tap, more like someone trying to make a point. I set down my tools and walked over, curious, but a little annoyed at the interruption. When I opened the gate, I saw a man standing there in a cheap-looking uniform with a badge pinned to his chest. He was about my age, maybe a bit older, with a buzz cut and a scowl that made him look like he had never smiled a day in his life. His name tag read Roger Hayes, and he had a clipboard in one hand and a radio clipped to his belt. I figured he was some kind of security guard, but I had no idea why he was at my house. Can I help you? I asked, trying to keep my tone polite, even though I was not thrilled about the interruption. Roger looked me up and down like I was a suspect in a crime show, then spoke in a flat, serious voice. I am with the HOA enforcement team, he said. Your garage is in violation of HOA rules. It is an unapproved structure and a potential safety hazard. You have 30 days to dismantle it, or you will face fines starting at $500. I stood there for a moment, blinking at him, trying to process what he had just said. My garage, a safety hazard. I had built it myself, following all the local building codes I could find, and it was just a simple structure to house my car. I had never heard of any HOA rules about it, and I was pretty sure I was not even part of their group. I crossed my arms and raised an eyebrow. What are you talking about? I asked. I never signed up for an HOA when I bought this house. Roger did not even flinch. He just stared at me, his expression cold and unyielding. The rules apply to all residents in Evergreen Meadows, he said. Now, this garage is not on the approved structure list, and it poses a risk to the community. You need to take it down or face the consequences. He handed me a citation notice, a piece of paper with the HOA logo at the top and a list of supposed violations. I glanced at it, seeing words like unapproved construction and potential liability, but it all sounded like nonsense to me. I looked back at him, trying to keep my cool. I teach third graders, I said with a small laugh. I am used to chaos, but this guy was on another level. Are you serious right now? I asked. You are telling me I have to tear down my garage because it is not approved. Roger nodded, his face still blank. That is correct, he said. If you do not comply within 30 days, we will escalate the matter. That could include legal action or further fines. I felt my stomach twist as I realized he was not joking. This was not some prank or misunderstanding. This guy actually thought he had the authority to fine me over my garage. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, even though I could feel my frustration building. Look, I said, my voice firm. I am not part of your HOA. I never signed any papers, and no one told me about any rules when I moved here. I think you have the wrong guy. Roger shook his head like I was a kid who did not understand the rules. That does not matter, he said. The HOA has jurisdiction over this neighborhood, and you are in violation. I suggest you take this seriously. He turned to leave, but not before adding one last thing. We will be back to check on your progress, he said over his shoulder. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. I watched him walk away, my jaw tight as I clutched the citation notice in my hand. I felt a mix of anger and disbelief as I closed the gate and went back to my garage. I looked at the Mustang sitting there all shiny and ready for its next tune-up, and I felt a pang of worry. This was my space, my escape, and now some random guy was threatening to take it away. I decided to ignore the notice at first, thinking it had to be a scam or a mistake. I mean, who shows up out of nowhere claiming to be an HOA cop and starts throwing around fines? I tossed the paper on my kitchen counter and tried to focus on my work, but I could not shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. The next morning, I woke up to find another letter from the HOA taped to my front door. It was on official-looking letterhead with the same logo as the citation notice, and it repeated everything Roger had said. It listed the violations in more detail, saying my garage needed to be registered with the HOA and meet specific safety standards like having a certain type of roof or fireproofing. It also said I would be fined $500 if I didn't comply within 30 days, and that further action could be taken if I ignored the warning. I stared at the letter, my hands shaking a little as I read the words, legal action, over and over. This was not a joke anymore. These people were serious, and they were coming for my garage. I knew I had to figure out what was going on, so I called my real estate agent, the woman who had sold me the house 2 years ago. I explained the situation, hoping she could clear things up. She sounded just as confused as I was. I do not recall any HOA paperwork for your property, she said, her voice uncertain. But sometimes these neighborhoods have HOAs that claim jurisdiction, even if it is not clear in the deed. You might want to check your documents yourself. I thanked her and hung up, feeling more frustrated than ever. I pulled out all the paperwork from when I bought the house, digging through the deed and the closing documents. Sure enough, there was no mention of an HOA anywhere. I had not signed anything agreeing to their rules, and I had never paid any dues. As far as I was concerned, I was not a member, and they had no right to tell me what to do with my property. But that letter on my counter told a different story, and I knew I could not just ignore it. I had to fight back, even if I did not know where to start. I looked out my window at the garage where my Mustang sat, waiting for, its next tune-up, and I felt a fire light inside me. This was my space, my passion, and I was not going to let some fake cop take it away from me. The days after Roger's visit turned into a nightmare I could not escape. I thought maybe he would just disappear after I told him I was not part of the HOA, but I was wrong. He started showing up at my house almost every other day, always with that same scowl on his face and a new citation notice in his hand. He would stand outside my gate taking photos of my garage with his phone, sometimes even walking into my yard without permission to get a closer look. Each time he left a new letter taped to my gate or my front door, each one more threatening than the last. The notices started piling up on my kitchen counter, a stack of papers that made my stomach churn every time I looked at them. One of the letters was particularly bad. It warned that if I did not dismantle the garage within 30 days, the HOA would take legal action, including property seizure. Roger handed me that one in person, his voice cold as he said, "We have the authority to escalate this. Do not test us." I stood there holding the letter, my hands shaking as I tried to wrap my head around what was happening. I am a teacher, not a lawyer, I thought to myself. How did a garage get me into this mess? It was not just the letters that got to me. It was the way Roger acted like he owned the place. He would show up at random times, sometimes early in the morning when I was getting ready for work, other times late in the evening when I was winding down. One evening, I was in the garage working on the Mustang's brakes when I saw him standing at the edge of my yard snapping photos again. I walked out, wiping the grease off my hands, and called out to him. "What are you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He did not even look up from his phone. Documenting non-compliance, he said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. I felt my blood boil. "You cannot just keep coming onto my property like this," I said, my voice louder than I meant it to be. He finally looked at me, his eyes narrowing. "We are just doing our job," he said. "If you do not take that garage down, there will be more consequences." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling helpless and angry. I went back to the garage, but I could not focus on the car anymore. All I could think about was how this guy was trying to take away something I had worked so hard to build. I knew I had to do something more than just ignore the notices, so I decided to go to the next HOA meeting. I figured if I could talk to the people in charge face to face, maybe I could explain my side and get them to back off. The meeting was held at the community center in Evergreen Meadows, a small building with a sign out front that read, "HOA board meeting, all residents welcome." I walked in feeling nervous, but determined, clutching a copy of the latest notice in my hand. The room was filled with about 20 people, most of them older residents who looked like they had been dealing with the HOA for years. At the front sat the board members with Susan Carver, the president, in the middle. She was a tall woman with sharp features and a smile that did not reach her eyes. I waited my turn to speak, and when I finally stood up, I explained my situation as calmly as I could. I told them I was not a member of the HOA, that I had never signed any papers, and that I did not understand why they were targeting my garage. Susan listened, her expression blank, then spoke in a tone that made my skin crawl. "Your garage is a safety hazard and an eyesore," she said. "It does not meet our community standards, and it poses a liability risk. You have 30 days to take it down, or we will be forced to take further action." I tried to argue, but she cut me off. "That is final," she said. Roger, who was standing at the back of the room, handed me another notice as I left, this one warning of fines up to $2,000 and further measures if I did not comply. I walked out of the meeting feeling worse than when I had gone in. I was starting to feel like I was in over my head, but then I found out I was not alone. A few days after the meeting, I was in my front yard raking leaves when my neighbor Tom Harper walked over. Tom was a friendly guy in his 50s who lived 2 houses down and always had a smile on his face. He asked how I was holding up, and I told him about the HOA and their threats about my garage. His smile faded, and he shook his head. They did the same thing to me, he said. Last year, they fined me $600 for my unapproved shed in the backyard. I thought it was legit, so I paid, but now I am not so sure. I asked if he had ever signed up for the HOA, and he shook his head. Not that I know of, he said. They showed up one day with a fine, and I did not know how to fight it. Hearing his story made me realize this was bigger than just me. I started talking to other neighbors, knocking on doors and asking if they had dealt with the HOA too. The stories came pouring out. One woman said she was fined $400 for a wrong colored fence, even though her fence had been there for years. Another guy told me he had to pay $300 because his driveway was too messy, whatever that meant. Everyone I talked to had a similar story. They were not sure if they were part of the HOA, but they had been fined anyway. And most of them had paid because they were scared of the consequences. Hearing all these stories lit a fire in me. I realized the HOA was not just targeting me. They were going after the whole neighborhood with these fake fines. I went back to Tom and told him what I had found out. He looked at me, his eyes wide, and said, "We have to do something about this, Lucas. We cannot let them keep bullying people like this." I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose I had not felt before. I knew I needed to fight back, not just for myself, but for everyone in Evergreen Meadows who had been scared into paying these fake fines. And Tom agreed to help me gather evidence, and we started making a plan. We went around the neighborhood collecting copies of the notices people had received, asking them to write down their stories and taking photos of the things the HOA had fined them for. It was a slow process, but with every story we heard, I felt more determined to take these people down. I looked at my garage where my Mustang sat waiting for its next tune-up, and I knew I could not let the HOA win. This was not just about my car anymore. It was about standing up for what was right. And with every new story I heard from my neighbors, I knew I could not let the HOA keep getting away with their scam. They were bullying people into paying fake fines, and I was determined to stop them. But I also knew I could not do it alone. I needed proof, something solid, to show that Roger and the HOA were breaking the law. So I decided to start documenting everything. I had a security camera system I had bought a while back, mostly to keep an eye on my garage when I was at work. It was one of those basic setups with a few cameras and an app on my phone that let me watch the live feed. I had not used it much before, but now it was going to be my secret weapon. I spent an afternoon setting up the cameras around my property, making sure one was pointed at the gate where Roger always showed up and another at the garage itself. I tested the system to make sure it was recording and I could see everything clearly on my phone. It felt a little strange turning my backyard into a surveillance zone, but I had to protect myself. I teach kids about science experiments, I thought to myself with a small laugh. This was one I never wanted to run, but I was catching a big fish. It did not take long for the cameras to pay off. Just a few days later, I got a notification on my phone while I was at school, grading papers during my lunch break. The motion sensor had picked up something at my gate. I opened the app, and there was Roger walking into my yard without permission. He had his phone out, taking photos of my garage, just like he had done before, but this time I had it all on video. He even tried the garage door, which I had locked. And when he could not get in, he walked around the side of the house, snapping more pictures. I watched the footage, my heart racing as I realized I had caught him trespassing on my property. Over the next week, the cameras recorded him coming back 3 more times, each time taking photos and leaving a new notice on my gate. I saved every video, downloading them to my laptop so I would have backups. I also started collecting the notices, keeping them in a folder with the dates written on each one. The language in the letters was getting more aggressive, with threats of legal action and fines that kept going up. One notice even said they could have my garage demolished if I did not comply. I looked at the stack of papers and felt a mix of anger and determination. They were not going to scare me into giving up. I knew I needed more than just videos to fight back, so I decided to get professional help. I started looking for a lawyer, someone who knew about HOA laws and could tell me if I had a case. After a few phone calls, I found Jessica Monroe, a lawyer in Spokane who specialized in HOA disputes. I set up a meeting with her and brought all my evidence, the videos, the notices, and the stories I had collected from my neighbors. Jessica was a no-nonsense woman in her 30s with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor that made me feel like I was in good hands. I explained everything to her, how Roger had been harassing me, how I was not a member of the HOA, and how they were targeting the whole neighborhood with fake fines. She listened carefully, flipping through the notices and watching the videos on my laptop. When I was done, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a small smile. Lucas, she said, you have a strong case here. You are not a member of the HOA, so they have no legal authority over you. What they are doing is harassment, and it looks like fraud too. We can sue them for both, and I think we can win. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had a real chance to fight back. Jessica explained that the first step was to build a solid case against the HOA, and she said the videos of Roger trespassing were a great start, but we needed more to prove the bigger picture that the HOA was running a scam. She suggested we get an official statement from the city to confirm I was not part of the HOA and to look into Roger's credentials to see if he was even a real enforcement officer. I agreed to everything she said, and we started working together to gather more evidence. I went back to my neighbors with Tom by my side, and we asked them to write down their stories in detail. We collected copies of the notices they had received and took photos of the things the HOA had fined them for, like Tom's shed and the woman's wrong-colored fence. I also reached out to the city office to get a copy of my property records, which confirmed I had never signed up for the HOA. Jessica took all of this and started putting together our lawsuit. She said we would sue the HOA for harassment, fraud, and illegal enforcement, and we would ask the court to dismiss all the fines and stop their fake enforcement unit. While Jessica worked on the legal side, I decided to take one more step to make sure we had everything we needed. I remembered that Tom had mentioned a friend of his who worked as a deputy at the Spokane County Sheriff's Office. I asked Tom to set up a meeting with him, and a few days later, we met with Officer Daniel Brooks. Daniel was a tall guy with a friendly smile who listened patiently as I explained the situation. I showed him the videos of Roger trespassing and the stack of notices with their threatening language. I also told him about the stories from my neighbors and how the HOA was targeting everyone with fake fines. Daniel watched the footage, his expression growing more serious with each clip. He took a close look at Roger's badge in one of the videos and shook his head. "That is not a real badge," he said. "This guy is not a licensed enforcement officer. I can look into his background, but from what you are telling me, this sounds like a scam." He agreed to investigate Roger's credentials and see if the HOA had any legal authority to enforce these fines. I thanked him, feeling a surge of hope as I left the meeting. With Daniel on our side, I knew we had a real shot at taking down the HOA. By the time we were done gathering evidence, I felt like we had built a fortress of proof. We had the videos of Roger trespassing, the notices with their threatening language, the stories from my neighbors, and confirmation from the city that I was not part of the HOA. Daniel came back a few days later with even more good news. He had looked into Roger's background and found out he had no training or certification to act as an enforcement officer. He was just a guy the HOA had hired to scare people into paying fines. Daniel also said he had spoken to a few other deputies who had heard complaints about the HOA from other neighborhoods in Spokane. It seemed like Susan and her board had been running this scam for a while, and we were about to blow it wide open. I looked at my garage where my Mustang sat waiting for its next tune-up, and I felt a sense of determination I had not felt before. I was ready to take this fight to court, and I was not going to back down until the HOA was stopped for good. With all the evidence we had gathered, I felt like we were ready to take on the HOA. Jessica, my lawyer, was confident we had a strong case, and I trusted her completely. She filed the lawsuit against the HOA on my behalf, alleging harassment, fraud, and illegal enforcement. We were not just asking the court to dismiss the fines against me. We were also seeking to have all the fake fines refunded to my neighbors and to have the HOA's fake enforcement unit shut down for good. Jessica prepared a thick stack of documents, including the videos of Roger trespassing, the threatening notices, the statements from my neighbors, and the confirmation from the city that I was not a member of the HOA. She also included Officer Daniel Brooks's report, which confirmed that Roger was not a licensed enforcement officer. I looked at the pile of evidence on her desk and felt a surge of hope. We were going into this fight with everything we had, and I was ready to see it through. Jessica looked at me with a determined smile and said, "Let us take these bullies down." Lucas, I nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement as we headed to the courthouse. The day of the court hearing arrived, and I was a bundle of nerves. I had never been to court before, and the idea of standing up in front of a judge made my stomach twist. But I knew I had to do this not just for myself, but for everyone in Evergreen Meadows who had been scammed by the HOA. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and a high desk where the judge sat. Susan Carver, the HOA president, was there with the rest of the board members, all dressed in business suits and looking smug, like they thought they could not lose. They had a polished legal team with them, a group of lawyers who looked like they charged by the minute. I sat next to Jessica, trying to stay calm as the hearing began. The judge, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, called the case, and Jessica stood up to present our side. She started by explaining that I was not a member of the HOA and that their attempts to fine me for my garage were illegal. She showed the videos of Roger trespassing on my property, pointing out how he had no right to be there since I was not part of their organization. She played the footage on a screen in the courtroom, and I watched as Susan's face tightened with every clip. Jessica then presented the notices showing the threatening language and the escalating fines that had no legal basis. She called me to the stand, and I told my story as honestly as I could, explaining how Roger had harassed me and how I had never signed up for the HOA. I felt my voice shake a little, but I kept going, knowing I had the truth on my side. Jessica did not stop with my story. She called up several of my neighbors to testify, including Tom Harper, who told the court how he had been fined $600 for his shed, even though he was not sure he was part of the HOA either. Other neighbors shared their experiences. One woman talked about the $400 fine for her fence. Another man described the $300 fine for his driveway. Each story painted a picture of a neighborhood under siege by an HOA that used fake fines to extort money from residents. Jessica then called Officer Daniel Brooks to the stand. Daniel explained that he had investigated Roger's credentials and found that he was not a licensed enforcement officer, just a hired hand with no legal authority. He also testified that the sheriff's office had received similar complaints about the HOA from other neighborhoods in Spokane, suggesting that this was a widespread scam. The judge listened carefully, taking notes as Daniel spoke, and I could see her expression growing more serious with every word. Jessica wrapped up our case by arguing that the HOA's actions were not just harassment, they were fraud. She asked the court to dismiss all the fines against me and my neighbors, to order the HOA to refund the money they had collected and to shut down their fake enforcement unit for good. The HOA's legal team got their chance to respond, and they came out swinging. Their lead lawyer, a slick guy in an expensive suit, argued that the HOA had every right to enforce their rules in Evergreen Meadows. He claimed that all residents were automatically part of the HOA, whether they signed up or not, because of some vague clause in the neighborhood's founding documents. He said the fines were necessary to maintain community standards and that my garage was a safety hazard that needed to be removed. He tried to discredit our evidence, saying the videos of Roger were taken out of context and that the notices were just standard procedure. He even suggested that I was the one causing trouble by refusing to comply with the rules. I felt my blood boil as I listened to him twist the truth. But Jessica squeezed my hand under the table, whispering to me to stay calm. She stood up to cross-examine their witnesses, including Susan Carver herself. Jessica asked Susan point blank if she could provide proof that I'd signed up for the HOA. Susan stammered, saying it was implied in the property records, but she could not produce any documents with my signature. Jessica then asked if Roger was a licensed enforcement officer, and Susan admitted he was not just a contractor they had hired. The judge raised an eyebrow at that, and I could tell she was not buying the HOA's story. After both sides had presented their cases, the judge took a short recess to review the evidence. I sat in the courtroom with Jessica and my neighbors, my heart pounding as we waited for her decision. It felt like an eternity, but finally the judge returned and called the court back to order. She looked directly at the HOA board members, her expression hard as she began to speak. The court finds that the HOA failed to provide sufficient evidence that the defendant, Lucas Bennett, is a member of their organization, she said. Furthermore, the actions of the HOA, including the use of an unlicensed individual to enforce fines and the threatening notices, constitute harassment and fraud. The fines against Mr. Bennett and the other residents are dismissed. The HOA is ordered to refund all fines collected from non-members and to pay the defendant's legal fees. Additionally, the HOA must immediately disband its enforcement unit and cease all illegal activities. The courtroom was silent for a moment as her words sank in, and then I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had won. We had won. The HOA board members looked like they had been slapped their faces pale as they whispered to their lawyers. Susan Carver stared straight ahead, her jaw tight, and I could tell she was furious, but I did not care. I turned to Jessica and gave her a huge hug, whispering thank you in her ear. She smiled and said, "You did great, Lucas." I looked at my neighbors, who were grinning and clapping each other on the back, and I felt a sense of pride I had not expected. I am just a teacher, I thought to myself, but I taught them a lesson they will not forget. The courtroom victory felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and it was not just me who felt it. The whole neighborhood of Evergreen Meadows seemed to breathe easier after the judge's ruling. Word spread fast, and by the next day, my neighbors were buzzing with excitement. People I had never even spoken to before stopped by my house to thank me, shaking my hand and telling me how relieved they were. It turned out the HOA had been a dark cloud over the neighborhood for years, and our win was like a ray of sunshine breaking through. To celebrate, we decided to throw a car show right in my backyard. It was Tom Harper's idea, and I loved it. We invited everyone in the neighborhood to bring their cars and show them off in my garage. It was a perfect way to reclaim the space that the HOA had tried to take from me. That Saturday, the street outside my house was lined with cars, everything from shiny new pickups to classic beauties, like my Mustang. Kids ran around playing tag while adults admired the vehicles and swapped stories about their own run-ins with the HOA. I had the garage door open, my Mustang parked front and center, and I could not stop smiling as I watched everyone enjoy the day. We toasted to our freedom with cold sodas and grilled burgers, and for the first time in months, I felt like Evergreen Meadows was truly a community again. The fallout for the HOA was swift and satisfying. Susan Carver resigned as president the very next day after the court ruling. I heard through the grapevine that she was humiliated by the whole ordeal and did not want to face the neighborhood after being exposed as a fraud. The rest of the board members followed her lead, stepping down one by one until the HOA was left with no leadership. Tom Harper stepped up to take over as the new president, and I could not have been happier with the choice. Tom was a fair guy who cared about the neighborhood, and he promised to rewrite the rules to make them clear and reasonable. He also made sure the HOA refunded all the fake fines they had collected, just like the judge had ordered. People started getting checks in the mail for the money they had paid, and I saw more than a few happy tears as my neighbors realized they were finally free from the HOA's grip. My garage, the one the HOA had tried so hard to tear down, became a symbol of resistance in Evergreen Meadows. Kids would point at it as they walked by, calling it the garage that beat the HOA, and I would just laugh and wave. And it felt good to know I had made a difference, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. And looking back on the whole ordeal, I realized how much I had learned through this fight. And I'd always been the kind of guy who kept his head down, focusing on my teaching and my hobbies without paying much attention to the fine print. But this experience taught me to be more vigilant, to really understand the rules that govern my neighborhood and to stand up when something is not right. I had to admit it was a tough few months. The stress of dealing with Roger's harassment, the HOA meetings, and the court case had taken a toll on me. There were nights I could not sleep, worrying about what would happen if we lost, but in the end, it was all worth it. I am a teacher, not a courtroom hero, I thought to myself with a small laugh, but I guess I revved up the right engine for this fight. I felt proud of what I had accomplished, not just protecting my garage, but helping my neighbors take back their peace of mind. It was a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when it feels like the odds are against you. I looked at my Mustang sitting in the garage, its chrome gleaming in the sunlight, and I knew I would never let anyone take that away from me again. Now I want to hear from all of you out there. Have you ever dealt with a fake cop or a bully HOA that tried to control your life? Maybe you have your own story of standing up to an organization that thought they could push you around. I would love to hear about it in the comments below. Let me know what you would have done in my situation. Would you have fought back like I did or found another way to deal with the HOA? And do you think I handled this the right way, or should I have done something different? I hope my story inspires you to stand up for what you care about, even if it means going to court to do it. If you think Susan got what she deserved, hit that like button and let me know. And do not forget to subscribe for more tales of garage battles and sweet justice. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.